106.5 FM and online. It's the After 5 Guest with Wynne Thomas.
And time for my After 5 guest today. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Lord Peter Hain and his book, Pitch Battles. Peter, thanks for your company this afternoon.
It's a pleasure. Good to be talking to you.
Stop the Tour campaign of 1969 against the Springboks Tour team. Was that a kind of rehearsal for the Stop the Tour of South African cricket team?
Yes, it was. We formed a campaign that I initiated in 1969, age 19, to stop the 1970 all-white South African cricket tour. Why? Because it was selected on a racist basis. You could only play then for South Africa under apartheid if you were white. If you were a brilliant cricketer, as Basil d'Oliveira was, if you remember him, he was a coloured South African of mixed race, born in the Cape Town area, and very good cricketer who could not play for his country, and he had to emigrate to England and ended up playing for the England team. And so that illustrated the way the apartheid system worked. Basil d'Oliveira could not play for his own country as he could have done now that apartheid is ended. So we set upon a campaign to stop white South African sports tours, and the 1970 cricket tour was the target. And in the meantime, we discovered that the Springboks were due to play and bring an all-white rugby team in the winter of 1969-70, and so we targeted that with the new tactic of invading the pitch, sitting down passively, non-violently, not creating any violence at all against either the players or police, and being dragged off. And what that did is it disrupted the matches, and that's something that happened at Swansea in November 1969, and indeed happened at pretty well most of the 25-match tour of that period from October through to January, October 1969 to January 1970.
So the cancellation of an England tour to South Africa in 1967 because the tour contained a black player, Basil d'Oliveira, that did light the blue touch paper for your protests.
Yes, it did. That was a key event. This happened in September 1968. England was due to tour South Africa, as, of course, it had done for generations. And Basil d'Oliveira was selected for that tour. He, of course, by then in 1968, when he, having broken into the England team, test team in 1966, had become one of its stars, a top cricketer, scoring centuries, taking wickets. He was an all-rounder, a medium-pace swing bowler, as well as a top-order batsman. And so he was a natural for that team. And when he was finally chosen after a whole controversy, initially he was excluded, and nobody could understand why. In fact, it emerged that a private deal had been done with the South Africans between Lord's cricket officials and the top white South African cricket officials. But eventually he was selected, and the South African Prime Minister, John Foster, who I might just add was interned during the Second World War for pro-Nazi activities, then cancelled the tour because they could not stomach the idea of a black player, Basil d'Oliveira, who really should have been playing for South Africa, coming as an England test team and playing against a white South African team, because that would have illustrated the whole iniquity, injustice, and horror of sports apartheid. So he cancelled the tour. And a few months later, in January 1969, as if nothing had happened, I mean, imagine the snub to England of saying, no, you can't come because we don't agree with somebody you've selected, even though he's been playing for you for a number of years. They then decided, the England cricket establishment at Lord's Cricket Ground meeting there, decided to invite the South Africans, the white South Africans, to tour in the summer of 1970. And I was so angry about this, coming straight after the exclusion of d'Oliveira and the stopping of the cricket tour by the apartheid government, that I resolved to try and disrupt it and stop it. And that's how the campaign got launched. And yes, Basil d'Oliveira, who himself was not political at all, but he was actually, in a way, an unwitting spur to that galvanized cross opinion, even middle ground opinion, which didn't understand why we were protesting about sport, into understanding the reason for it.
Now, I spoke to you in the late 80s and asked you whether the violence and disruption used in 69 and 70 was regretted. How do you feel about that now?
We didn't use violence when we ran on the pitch, for example, at Swansea in 1969. And if you look back at the reports of that match in November 1969, you'll see that the demonstrators were non-violent. They were in the tradition of the suffragettes, of putting themselves on the line, running on the pitch, interrupting play and lying down, and then being dragged off. And at Swansea in November 1969, the demonstrators were thrown back into the crowd and beaten up by rugby stewards. I had a couple of my friends who one had a jaw broken, the other nearly lost an eye. And even independent commentators like the Times reporter, and the Times was not supportive of our protests, condemned the police and the rugby vigilantes for the way they'd behaved at Swansea, at St Helens in November 1969. And that was the worst of the 25-match tour, that violence. Sadly, I'm speaking to you from Neath, which I represented for nearly a quarter of a century and in which I still live. Mm-hmm. And of course, Swansea's just down the road, and I've been to St Helens, and those days seem a long time ago. But I don't accept the charge that we were the ones bringing violence. It was when we were attacked for being non-violent protesters. Direct action, yes. We were putting ourselves, trying to interrupt the matches, but we were not being violent.
But,
so to finally answer your question, no, I do not regret that at all. In fact, I think our protests have been vindicated, and there's no better vindication than in the 2019 Rugby World Cup final, when a black Springbok captain, Siya Kolisi, lifted the cup, the World Cup, as the Springboks vanquished England to win the World Cup. Now, Siya Kolisi and his fellow black players, who comprised about half that team, that 1969 2019 World Champions side, they would not have been able to play for the Springbok team that we disrupted during their tour in 1969-70 because it was against the laws of apartheid.
So you were only 19. Was it a big responsibility to lead that campaign? And was it the kind of the treatment your parents had in South Africa, which kind of spurred you on as well?
It was, and it was not a responsibility that I'd expected. I'd expected in my late teens to be a foot soldier in the campaign, even though it was my idea. I'd expected others, more senior luminaries in the anti-apartheid movement to take the leadership, but one thing led to another, and it's explained in our book, Pitch Battles, Sport, Racism and Resistance, how I came to lead that campaign. It was a big responsibility, and I found myself at the eye of a storm because there was huge controversy, a great deal of anger around our demonstrations, and a lot of rugby fans, including in South Wales, didn't understand why we were doing what we were doing. And I don't think that understanding really crystallized until after Nelson Mandela came out of prison and people started to understand the reason for our protests. And I had lots of people, including in Neath and in Swansea, where I spent the last 31 years of my life, coming up to me and saying, look, I hated you in those days, but and some even claimed to have carried me off the pitch at St Helens in November 1969.
But you weren't there, Peter, were you?
I wasn't actually there. No, I was in London. I wasn't able to attend all of the matches, but they still claimed they wouldn't accept it. Some people have said, "I'm voting for you, Peter, in the coming election," but I carried you off the pitch, so it was one of those.
It's become legendary, Peter.
It certainly became part of folklore. I stopped denying it in the end because why spoil a good story for the sake of the truth?
But going back to the Battle of Swansea, as it's been described. Some of those protests were actually attacked by what they called vigilantes.
Yes, they were. I mean, there had been a recruitment drive amongst local rugby clubs, and some including from Neath, who volunteered to come to the match and act as stewards, because of course by then it was about, I think, half a dozen matches into the tour, and the previous matches had been disrupted, and so trouble was expected, and there was a big demonstration outside the grounds, where I think around 1,000 protesters marched outside, but then inside about 100 had bought tickets, which was my strategy. My favourite strategy was to buy a ticket, get into the ground and try and stop the match through non-violent direct action. And so, there was a great deal of trouble. And the vigilantes, as they were called, the rugby stewards, as they would describe themselves, were the most vicious ones. They were the ones that beat our punishment after the police had thrown demonstrators that they carried off. And I stress, the demonstrators didn't resist. It was our instructions: don't fight the police, don't fight anybody, just put your body on the line. As I say, I think the nearest comparison is the suffragettes in their fight for the votes for women, and take a stand against racism in sport.
So it didn't stop the tour, but it did stop the cricket tour, didn't it? I mean, the South African tour went on. Although the South African players sort of voted to go home at Christmas time, they still continued, but the cricket tour was stopped, wasn't it? So you were successful there.
The cricket tour was stopped, but it was really the rugby, the Springbok, anti-Springbok campaign that, and remember, during that campaign, the then leader of South African rugby, who was a legend in himself, as you'll remember, Dani Craven, he said, "Over my dead body will there be a black Springbok." Well, of course, fast forward to 2019, and that's precisely what happened because of our campaign to stop them. And Nelson Mandela told me when he came out of prison that he thought that campaign was very important in his eventual release and the transition to apartheid, so that people can now play and be selected for their country on grounds of merit, not the colour of their skin. But to answer your question, the rugby tour demonstrations made such an impact that it became very clear that we would have wrecked the cricket tour. We had about 100,000 protesters mobilised by May 1970, with the cricket tour weeks away, when eventually it was stopped. But by that stage, it had become not just an argument between the anti-apartheid movement and the Lord's cricket establishment, the English cricket establishment, but actually an international controversy, because the Commonwealth Games were due to take place in Edinburgh in July 1970. So they would have the games would have coincided with the white South African cricket tour, which would have been the focus of massive protests, and that became an important factor in the eventual stopping of the tour, because at our request, the anti-apartheid movement's request, a lot of countries started withdrawing from those games. All African countries withdrew. That meant around 30 African countries, followed by India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka, followed by the Caribbean countries. And so it would have been an all-white Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh, accompanied by an all-white South African cricket tour, and that was an impossible position for the Commonwealth Games and for Britain to find itself in. There was also a great deal of concern, because by that stage, many British West Indians had become big cricket fans in themselves, had joined the anti-apartheid struggle, and I reached out to them to involve them, because they themselves were suffering from racism, and they joined our campaign. And fascists and racists in groups like the National Front, the Nazi National Front, were supporting the campaign, and so it also became an issue of race relations in Britain. So having been an idea in my own mind as a 19-year-old, when the cricket tour was announced in 1969, spread and became created an international furore, and all of those factors, including the fact that we'd have wrecked the tour and there'd have been a great deal of trouble, forced its cancellation. Much to my relief, I might say, Wynne, because I was really worried about the extent of the confrontations that would undoubtedly have occurred had the tour not been stopped. I was so pleased both a victory for the anti-apartheid movement, in many respects one of the biggest victories we ever had in the bitter and long and hard struggle against apartheid, which people forget. But I was also joyous at the victory, but relieved that we didn't have to go through all that difficulty.
So the book, Peter, just to finally say that the book Pitch Battles, what will people find in the book? What's the book like?
Well, the whole story of Pitch Battles goes right the way back to the origins of racism in sport in South Africa, and Britain played a very important part in that, because the origins of apartheid in sport were not put down, were not established after the Second World War when apartheid was. They went back to the late 19th century when Cecil John Rhodes, the governor of South Africa under British colonial rule, and other important British colonial rulers, including in cricket, which Britain had brought to South Africa. The British Army had brought to South Africa, as it had done to other parts of the Commonwealth, right across the world. And there was racism then. And in fact, we described this in Pitch Battles. My co-author, Andre Oudendal, who himself was a first-class cricketer and refused to play apartheid cricket. He was a Cambridge Blue, having studied over here, and he lives in Cape Town now. And we show how there was a Basil d'Oliveira precedent in the 1890s, an explosive fast bowler called Crom Hendricks, who was regarded as being probably one of the best fast bowlers in the world. But Cecil John Rhodes and his cronies decided that Crom Hendricks couldn't represent South Africa touring England, even though international cricket opinion reckoned he was possibly the best fast bowler in the world. So the origins of racism in South African sport go back, I'm afraid, to the British, as indeed to the origins of apartheid. And we describe it in the book. And we also show how you can't really divorce sport, much as sports fans, and I'm a football fan, I'm a fan of the Swans and also Chelsea Football Club. I'm passionate about sport, about cricket, about rugby, and about Formula One motor racing.
Mm-hmm.
But sport can't be divorced from life. And, I think sport in that era thought that it could continue regardless of whether racism was infesting it, as it was. Those teams that came from South Africa, whites-only teams, effectively Swansea Rugby Club that day in November 1969, and East Rugby Club shortly afterwards, Wales playing against the Springboks, Glamorgan, if they'd played against, as they would have done against that South African tour of 1970, the cricket tour, would have all been complicit in apartheid. And we tell the story in Pitch Battles, and we show how, much as all of us sports fans would like us to be in a little oasis, we can't separate from issues of morality and justice and individual freedom in sport any more than we can in our daily lives.
Well, Peter, thanks so much for being my After Five guest today. It's been a delight to talk to you once again. So it's sort of like a third time I've interviewed you. It's absolutely brilliant. And there's the book. So the book is called Pitch Battles. It's readily available. And say thank you much for being my After Five guest today.
It's a pleasure. It's been a delight. Thank you.
Thank you much indeed. Thank you. Bye-bye now.